Well, thanks very much. I'm very happy to be here. And it's been really interesting hearing different perspectives and different diets. I come from research on seafood, particularly in the tropics. And today I'm going to be talking to you about blue foods and thinking a little bit about how they might contribute to resilient diets. This is work I've been doing at Lancaster University with a great team of collaborators who are up there, and all of this work couldn't have been done without their help. So blue foods, and I'm talking about fish today, we know they're concentrated sources of essential micronutrients. These nutrients, some shown here, are essential in childhood development. They've been linked with early mortality, and we know that when your diets are lacking in these nutrients, you're malnourished. Now, fish are particularly unique as an animal source food because they contain a diverse quantity of nutrients. And those nutrients are also bioavailable, so they're uptaken by the body much more readily. And so this is a study we did looking at tropical fish that are associated with coral reefs. And what we wanted to show was that diversity of nutrients. So tropical reef fish have more calcium, omega-3 fatty acids, vitamin A than many other land-based meats. And the concentrations are so high that they're considered sources for many of these nutrients. Now, this sort of emphasizes the importance of fish to people's diets in the tropics, particularly in places like sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia. These places have high nutrient deficiencies already. And so fish can and do contribute to healthy diets in these places. But fish themselves are extremely diverse, as I'm sure you know. And we looked at the nutrient diversity among different groups of fish species. So these groups on the y-axis, these bars show you their nutrient density for these 6 micronutrients. And the higher the bar, the more nutritious this group is, and they're contributing more to your recommended intakes of these 6 nutrients. And what I just want to focus on in this first half of the talk is these 2 groups at the top of each of the freshwater and marine sections. So the carps and cyprinids, often small fish that live in lakes, and then in the oceans, the herrings and anchovies. So these fish are the most nutritious you can get out there. In sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, they're often dried, and that makes them really great for transporting to places that are not near water bodies. When they're dried, they're often eaten whole, so they're even more nutritious. And so these 2 groups are really the most nutritious fish you can get out there. We were interested in how affordable these groups are. And this is an analysis of the affordability of different fish in 39 countries, low and middle income countries, in a project I was involved in with World Fish and Duke University. And as you can see, those 2 groups come out again. They're the cheapest of all fish. Most other fish are sort of similar price, or there's some variability within those groups, but these 2 groups are the 2 most affordable. So this high nutrient content, high affordability implies that these fish are playing an important role around the world in healthy diets. We also were interested in these countries, which was the cheapest nutritious fish. And again, this pulls out these 2 groups, the cyprinids from freshwater systems like lakes, and the herrings and anchovies from countries with coastlines. Those were the cheapest nutritious groups. And they also were caught in really high amounts. So they were caught between 25 and 40% of the national catch was represented by these 2 groups. So not only are they affordable, nutritious, they're also readily available. Now, you can link this kind of information to understand how blue foods might contribute to vulnerable groups like young children. In sub-Saharan Africa, the bars on the right-hand side show you the proportion of that small pelagic catch, which could feed all of the children living within 10 kilometers of a water body with a daily portion of fish. So these sort of figures show you that a very small fraction of that catch is needed to feed a high number of people. And it really emphasizes their important role in providing healthy diets. Now, what about the shocks and extremes? If we focus on the marine fisheries, small pelagics on the west coast of Africa, there are shocks from ocean warming, overfishing, use in animal feeds instead of human consumption, and extractive trade that removes these nutritious fish to other places, and again might go into feeds. So in the case of marine small pelagic fish, the big issue seems to be, rather than a shock and extreme, but press disturbance that is removing the ability of these fisheries to supply resilient and healthy diets. If we switch to the inland situation, so the inland species I'm talking about, these cyprinids, mostly caught in the Great Lakes, and the shocks and extremes or the risks to the supply of this essential food comes from things like food waste. So in the processing of small pelagic fish, you might have a lot of wastage. Some parts of these lakes are experiencing eutrophication, and that's a climate impact and an agricultural runoff impact that threatens the ability of the lake to provide or support a productive fishery. And you also have, again, the issue of animal feeds that might be diverting these nutritious fish to other sources. So this sort of brings me nicely to thinking about climate change, and that's sort of the area I've been most interested in understanding the effects of climate change on seafood supply in the tropics. So the map on the top left shows you the expected change in catch around the world by 2050. And you can see that the areas in red in the tropics, they're going to have a large decrease in catch. And that is a long-term gradual shock, I suppose, that is removing the potential of marine ecosystems to feed people. We look at the graph on the right-hand side of the map. This outlines areas that are fringed by important coastal ecosystems. And again, these are, as we know, under threat from climate change. And I particularly want to talk just now about coral reefs and the impacts of heat waves. So I've been working in Seychelles in the Indian Ocean with my colleague Nick Graham, and we've been trying to understand what's happened in Seychelles since a major heat wave in 1998 caused all the corals to die and led to sort of half the reefs on Seychelles recovered 20 years later, and the other half turned into this seaweed reef situation. And we've been looking at the implications for food supply to people in Seychelles who eat a lot of fish. Now, we've got information on the fish on these reefs, and we know that fish that eat seaweed actually did very well since the bleaching event, and there are more of these fish on the seaweed reefs. So you can see these boxes going over time, that there's more biomass of these seaweed-eating fish on the reefs that succumbed to seaweed. On the right-hand side, we've got parrotfish, and they more associate with rubble, detritus, and coral habitats. And we also see that on the reefs that recovered their coral, these fish are doing even better than they were before bleaching. So these two plots give you an idea of the resiliency of the fish populations. And it turns out that that translated to a resiliency in the fishery. So fishers are catching more or the same amount of these two fish groups than they were before the bleaching event. So fishers in Seychelles use these traps to catch these two groups of fish. And we can see that since the bleaching event in 1998, the catches have been maintained despite this really drastic change in the ecosystem. So what does this mean for diets? Well, we know from surveys of mothers and children in Seychelles that fish do contribute to micronutrient intakes, and that from our own analysis of the reef fish that people are eating, that the reef fish I've just shown you contribute to or can contribute to your recommended intakes of these essential nutrients. Again, using that information on the biomass of fish underwater and converting that information to the availability of nutrients to fishers, we see that since the bleaching event on these two different ecosystem types, so the red is the macroalgae and the recovering is the recovering corals, the biomass and the availability of nutrients to fishers has gone up over time relative to the pre-bleaching level, which is this dashed line here. So our study in Seychelles really used ecological data, used fisheries information, information on people's diets, and all of that evidence suggests that coral reefs will remain important nutrient sources despite this massive climate impact. So the resiliency of the ecosystem translated to resiliency in the food supply. And this was a bit of a surprise, and I think it's interesting to have our expectations challenged like this. And we're seeing similar sorts of changes in reef fish ecosystems after bleaching events around the world, in Australia, in Chagos Archipelago, different parts of the world. When they lose corals, they have this rebound of herbivorous fish. So sort of trying to broaden this and bring us back to some of the issues that we've heard about this morning already. We know, or we expect, the supply of nutritious food to decline. So that loss in nutrient quality of crops is expected. That loss of marine fisheries production around the world is expected, particularly in the tropics. We're expecting to see large changes, up to 50% of a loss in catch. And the impact of that shock to people's diets who rely on seafood is definitely going to be huge. Now, when we're thinking about resilience, I think what we're learning is that this is very system and context specific. When we look at Seychelles and we see the coral reefs that have been devastated by heat waves, we see a resiliency in the fish populations, and we see that sort of being translated to people's diets. So I think the next steps or the gaps in our understanding is that we need to have this really interdisciplinary focus, think about how do ecosystems link to people's health through fisheries or through other food production systems, and to start to think about fish as food systems. As lots of people have been saying for many years now, we need to be taking a more holistic view of fisheries and aquaculture and thinking about how they contribute to diets along the supply chain and connecting that to the ecosystem health. I think I'll stop there. Thanks all for your time and looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much, James, for leading us off into the session with a great discussion on aquatic foods. We'll move to our next speaker, who is Dr. Matti Kummu from Aalto University. Matti?
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks, James, for the really nice presentation. I will start sharing my screen. Does it show okay?
Yes, it looks great.
And you can hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect. Okay. So thanks indeed, James, for looking at the aquatic part of the kind of challenge and opportunities we have toward on the sustainable food future. I will concentrate on the terrestrial part, and a little bit different focus as well. But starting kind of in the yesterday news was that we are now, according to some estimates, 8 billion people in the planet, and still, according to some other estimates, we are still producing more food per capita than ever. So we are really kind of so basically that we are better off than ever. Of course, there are still a lot of people suffering from hunger we have seen over the last year or so the kind of the vulnerability of the global food supply chain on the shocks, what's happening in Ukraine and the COVID and something else. But then going back to this planet, from the planetary point of view, this is putting, of course, a lot of pressure on the different parts of the planet and ecosystems and so forth. One way of measuring this are the planetary boundaries, as you well know. This is a little bit outdated figure, but still best published what I was able to find. So basically, yeah, many of the planetary boundaries are transgressed, and even, for example, novel entities earlier this year came a study that even that is transgressed. Freshwater was another study that the green water has been transgressed, and our preprint also suggested blue water as well. Phosphorus, nitrogen, biosphere integrity, land system, and you can see here in dots the role of agriculture. So it's for sure the largest kind of a player or cause for these transgressions, especially on the biochemical flows, water, land system chains, and biodiversity. And this is the global view. But of course, when looking then a little bit more kind of details, where do these occur, these transgressions? So here is a study from this year. So above zero is that it's exceedance of this kind of boundary, local boundary, and negative values it's on the safe side. So we see here, not surprising that where most of the kind of the intensive agriculture is located from the previous map, there is always also the nitrogen boundaries has been crossed. This, I'm not going to details, this is a very recent study of ours now in the preprint. We were looking the blue and green water planetary boundaries with the new way, looking kind of comparing the changes to pre-industrial time and looking in which part of the globe there has been significant drying or wetting compared to these parts. So we found this is blue water that's in large parts. There has been a lot of kind of significant drying, whereas in the north, probably due to climate change, it's wetter than in pre-industrial time. Green water, the story is a little bit similar, a bit more complex in some parts, but yes, so we have been transgressing both many of the local boundaries in various parts of the globe, but also the global boundaries for these both. The same goes for biodiversity. This is below the 90 kind of percentage of the original biodiversity is set a boundary here for transgressing the local boundaries. We can see that there are in large part of the globe there has been quite severe transgressions even in the biodiversity. And then also on the land use, this is not directly planetary boundary, but this is more kind of the intensity of agriculture as a proxy for this one. We can see that there are either intensive cropland or then intensive pasture in over 1/3 of the globe. So when putting all this then to the kind of when looking in the future, it doesn't seem to ease. So this is the population is increasing from 8 billion to 10 billion by 2050, especially in Africa, where population is doubling from today within the next 30 years or so. There are some places in the Eastern Europe, for example, where the population is expected to decrease even. And then, of course, climate change, as was already mentioned by James, it's also putting pressure on the food crops. And there has been already observed changes in the yield due to the warming climate. And then, if we put all this together, so we are already transgressing a lot of the planetary boundaries. We are putting even more pressure with more people, more consumption, and the climate change, among many other pressures. And then if we look there's another study of ours where we were looking the resilience. This is kind of, we were looking the adaptive capacity of humans, and then already kind of the existing pressures as the ecological vulnerability. And then kind of looking where there is still resilience for new changes, or where the resilience is the smallest. So if we kind of combine, okay, of course, not very scientifically, but kind of my view. So many of the places where there's a lot of pressure, there is big changes in the future, but there is also low resilience to adapt to these changes. So lots needs to be done. But then, yes, another part of the presentation, I'm trying to kind of go through the opportunities what we have. There are many of those, but of course it requires quite drastic changes, how we produce our food, what we consume, and so forth. This is where my current research mostly concentrates on the opportunities. A few years ago, we published a first national global study where we were looking the kind of 3 of these conventional opportunities. We were looking diet change, food loss reduction, and yield gap closure. And we found that with the moderate implementation, of these measures, we could double the food production. But of course, there are large differences of the means and also on the potential. So if we, for example, we see here that regarding the diet in many places, it's from this perspective, it's quite sustainable. So basic diet change, meaning that we would, change the kind of animal protein to the plant protein, which is more sustainable. So in many parts of mostly these green and blue areas, the diet is more or less sustainable, but then a lot of potential on the North America and Europe as well. And then the yield gap closure has a lot of potential in Africa and Asia. So basically kind of increasing sustainably the yields by more optimum use of water and nutrients. And then the potential varies a lot from almost 500% to few tens of percents. So there is but a lot of potential in many of these vulnerable areas for sure. But then, of course, this was the kind of assumption that we want to increase the resources use, which we already use too much. So there is a need for U-turn. So basically, meaning that we should first kind of decrease the resources use to stay within the planetary boundaries, and then sustainably increase again the food production within the planetary boundaries. So here we found that with the current practices, we could feed within planetary boundaries only 3 billion people, whereas then we could sustainably increase the food production. We could feed the population in 2050. But this is a major change, and here you see kind of more details in the maps what it would mean. So basically, full restoration of, say, operating space. In some places, it would mean basically almost zero food production. And then even if we would sustainably increase the food production, include the diet change, reduced food losses, there would be still places which couldn't come up with the kind of with the present food production within the planetary boundaries. So there are opportunities, but it would require quite drastic changes in the food production and also in the consumption patterns. There are other ways as well. We published a couple of months ago a study on kind of what it would mean if we would go towards more circular food systems in terms of feeding the livestock. And we found that so this is the current feed use of pigs, poultry, cattle, and so forth. And we were concentrating on kind of replacing the food competing feeds with the byproducts and other kind of non-competing feedstuffs. And we found that they're not going to more details here, but we found that there are in many of these, for example, cereal bran or citrus pulp or molasses, crop residues, there's a lot of potential, this blue area, to be used as a feed. And by doing so, it could increase 12% the global food supply without using more resources, meaning food for 1 billion people. The same than we could do, for example, if we would halve the food losses, that would also free up food for 1 billion people. So there are a lot of opportunities, and of course many others, as you have learned as well. So there are these lab meats and bioreactors producing proteins, the vertical farms, and so forth. So this was my story today, looking the kind of the pressures, what are the challenges and opportunities, and then of course this is just one part or two parts of the stories. So basically, we should go towards sustainable use of resources and then use these food opportunities for that. And then, of course, the social feasibility, which was lacking from my presentation, and it's still, of course, a lot of research has been done and is being done. So this is the crucial part, how all this would be happened in an equitable and sustainable way from social perspectives, people's perspective. So yeah, thanks for your attention, and looking forward to the further discussion of the topic.
Thank you, Matti, for that very nice overview of the sort of systemic changes that we need to be thinking about in terms of planetary boundaries. And with that, I would like to introduce our final speaker for this session, Dr. Kyle Davis from the University of Delaware. Kyle?
Yep. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I'll turn on my video if it's allowed.
You're more
Can
than
everybody
welcome
see
to.
me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I feel like it's a little more, you can see who's talking this way. So let me share my screen and pull up my presentation. All right, can you see that okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So yeah, thanks to James and Matti for those really interesting presentations. I always learn a lot at these types of panel discussions and presentations by different researchers. So thanks so much for that. So yeah, I'm really broadly interested in kind of the complementarity between sustainability and resilience. Thinking about ways that we can measure the different dimensions of sustainability as it relates to food systems, but also how we can measure and quantify aspects of resilience within food systems as well. So the work that I'm presenting here is aimed at trying to address the latter, measuring production stability in particular at high spatial resolutions. So this is some work from a lit review that we recently did. And so we were looking at trying to understand where kind of the state of knowledge is related to food supply chains and different food groups as it relates to different types of environmental disruptions. So this first figure is just showing the number of studies broken down by different food groups that we were able to identify for investigating different steps in the food supply chain. And what's really obvious here is that the vast majority of studies related to environmental disruptions are focused on crops at the production stage. And so we're also able to break down those studies based on the types of environmental disruptions that are affecting different steps in the food supply chain. And probably not surprising to any of you as well, we found that the vast majority of studies have focused on climate and weather-related disruptions at the production stage again. And this is reinforced by other recent research. This is a paper that probably a lot of you are familiar with by Cottrell et al., published back in 2019 in Nature Sustainability, and they looked at production shocks in within the food supply chain, and they found that especially for crops, crop production in particular, that a large fraction of shocks that they were able to identify were associated with, to some extent, with climate and weather. So all of this is to say that based on the current state of knowledge on environmental disruptions within the food supply chain, really the most well-established portion of that knowledge relates to climate-related shocks at the production stage as it relates to crop production. And so there are lots of opportunities for environmental disruptions to impact the production stage. There are also lots of opportunities for different types of environmental disruptions, and combined with economic influences to affect subsequent steps in the food supply chain as well. And there are opportunities for disruptions at upstream steps in the food supply chain to cascade through and affect subsequent steps in the food supply chain. So disruptions at the production level can obviously have an influence on storage and processing, distribution, retail and markets, and ultimately consumption. So with that motivation in mind, that really there's the greatest certainty that there's a large influence of environmental disruptions on crop production, we're interested in asking where is crop production most susceptible to climate-related losses? And so we used global gridded data sets of rain-fed and irrigated yields and harvested areas for 18 major crops. And we combined that with a daily process-based crop water model and historical climate data to estimate grid cell or pixel level crop-specific actual evapotranspiration for each year between 1960 and 2019. And so we then sorted that those actual evapotranspiration estimates in ascending order, and looked at what was the 50th percentile actual evapotranspiration for a particular crop in a particular pixel, and what's the 10th percentile. So we assumed that the 50th percentile actual evapotranspiration corresponds to median historically observed climate conditions in a particular location, and 10th percentile corresponds to extreme adverse historically observed climate conditions. And so using known empirical relationships between actual evapotranspiration and yield, we were able to estimate a measure that we've developed that we just simply refer to as climate sensitivity for each crop, rain-fed and irrigated. And we just calculate climate sensitivity as the relative difference between the yield at 10th percentile actual evapotranspiration and the yield at median actual evapotranspiration. So when we apply this to a particular crop globally across these global gridded maps of crop yield and harvested area, we're able to develop these really neat maps to look at a high spatial resolution where crop yields tend to be most susceptible or variable in response to climate variability. So this is showing an example of the climate sensitivity for rain-fed maize, and the darker the red color, the more sensitive rain-fed maize yields are in that particular location. So you can see some kind of hotspot areas, the US Midwest, there's a few, central and northern India, as well as the Indus Basin up in Pakistan, as well as Indonesia. So this allows for, identifying at a broad global scale where interventions may need to be prioritized for particular crops in order to address the influences of climate variability on stabilizing crop yields. And so with these maps, with this information on climate sensitivity as well, we can also use it to explore different types of interventions that might be used to help stabilize yields and reduce climate sensitivity. So one example of that is we looked at opportunities for irrigation expansion. So we combined our maps of, this is showing a combination of our map of rain-fed maize climate sensitivity overlaid with maps of where there's currently sustainable or unsustainable irrigation occurring. So the sustainable areas are shown in blue, the unsustainable areas are shown in fuchsia. And you can see that some places there's great opportunity for irrigation expansion to occur sustainably in order to convert high variability rain-fed crops into irrigated croplands. But there are also places where places that are probably not surprising to any of you, that where water resources are already being unsustainably used. So you can see, for instance, here in the North China Plain, there's a large unsustainable area. Also, much of India shows that there's not really much opportunity for irrigation expansion. And so we can also zoom in and look at different locations within countries where there's opportunities for sustainable irrigation expansion to address rain-fed climate sensitivity for different crops. And this is just showing another example of climate sensitivity. This is for rain-fed rice, and the hotspots are more intense and more widespread for rain-fed rice. So you can see along the Sahel region here in Western Africa, parts of Central Europe, and much of India. There's a lot of there's high sensitivity to climate variability for rain-fed rice in those locations. And similarly, we can look at the places. We can compare this to opportunities for sustainable or unsustainable irrigation expansion, and see to what extent there are opportunities to do that in order to minimize rice yield sensitivity to climate variability. And this is just showing another zoom in. Again, India is a place where freshwater resources are already being unsustainably utilized across much of the country, so there's not really much opportunity for irrigation expansion to address this climate-related yield variability. And so, in addition to looking at opportunities to expand irrigation sustainably, we also wanted to look at whether there are complementary interventions to enhance the resilience and stability of yields and crop production. So what I'm showing here, within each of these panels along the diagonal, the dashed line corresponds to cumulative production and climate sensitivity for rain-fed production for that particular crop, and the solid line corresponds to irrigated production. So what you would ideally like to see is these lines being shifted far to the right, where the vast majority of cumulative production has a low climate sensitivity. And so for this example of rice, it's not surprising that the line for cumulative rain-fed rice production is to the left of the line for irrigated rice production, because rain-fed crop production just tends to be more vulnerable to climate variability. But what this also allows us to do is to do paired comparisons for different crops. And so we controlled for spatial overlap across these different pairs of crops that are all cereals and all grown during the monsoon season. And what you'll notice is that with these comparisons to the rice cumulative distribution function lines, that all of the other three crops that we looked at in this example, maize, sorghum, and pearl millet, have lines that are further shifted to the right, meaning that their production overall tends to be less sensitive to climate variability. So what that implies is that there's potential opportunities for crop switching, especially in places where there's not opportunities for sustainable irrigation expansion. So we looked country by country and globally to see for sustainable irrigation expansion and selective crop switching, to what extent could you reduce production losses from climate variability and increase production as a result of expanded irrigation or switching to crops that have lower climate sensitivity but a higher yield. So you can see that for a lot of the countries that we look at, that irrigation expansion shows greater promise for reducing production losses and increasing production overall. But there are certain countries where crop switching can play an important role in contributing to those benefits as well. So at the global level, we estimate that a combination of sustainable irrigation expansion and selective crop switching can reduce rain-fed climate-related production losses by about 62% and simultaneously increase production by 14%. And so as part of the review that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we also looked at what are ways to make food supply chains more resilient and more stable against environmental disruptions. So we did a comprehensive overview of different interventions that are possible at each step in the food supply chain, as well as which actors may be able to implement those types of interventions. So for production, there's a really long list of interventions that can help to improve the resilience of food supply chains, and that includes things like subsidies, crop and index insurance, investment in technology and on-farm infrastructure, diversification of production, and shifts in timing of planting, among many other solutions. At the storage and processing step, countries and different actors can invest in things like strategic reserves and food storage, also investment in storage infrastructure more generally to improve cold storage and the like, and strengthening of food safety standards. At the distribution step, things like vertical integration, investment in physical infrastructure like roads, and also revisiting of trade and investment agreements, tariffs, and sanctions to help shape decisions in a direction that makes food supply chains more resilient. At the retail and marketing stage, there are interventions that can be done related to marketing, taxes and subsidies that can influence decisions about whether more resilient or less resilient foods are purchased, and again, a strengthening of food safety standards. And at the consumption stage, things like dietary shifts, social safety nets, food aid, and food supplementation can all be ways to help enhance resilience at that step in the food supply chain. So just to summarize, it's clear that climate and other natural and human-made disruptions can impact any step of the food supply chain, and crops at the production step have the greatest evidence that they're most exposed to these types of disruptions. Also, through our analysis of climate sensitivity, we're able to show that global hotspots of crop climate sensitivity are widespread. That the location and intensity of hotspots can differ across crops and countries. And this type of spatially detailed information can be used to test out a variety of climate smart interventions. And I just showed an example of a couple: sustainable irrigation expansion and crop switching. And by addressing climate sensitivity at the production stage for crops, this can go a long way towards preventing cascading impacts along the entire food supply chain. And as Matti alluded to, recent global events show that food supply chains remain vulnerable to different types of disruptions, but we've also shown, and Matti also mentioned, that there are many solutions that exist for adapting to those shocks. So just want to briefly draw your attention to a focus issue that Matti and I were guest editors on. In case it's of interest to you, you can scan away. It's the focus is on sustainable food systems, and it covers a lot of the topics that we're discussing across the panels for these 2 different days. So if you're interested in learning more, please take a look. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Carl, for that great talk. And it's interesting that you mentioned the focus issue that you worked on, because I did have a couple of questions for you and Matti related to that later on. So now that we've come to the end of our talks, it's time for, again, the most fun part, which is the panel discussion. So delighted to have all of you here for that. So I think in this session, one theme that stood out to me was how we were transitioning between scales as we spoke, as different speakers presented their work. So we started with findings from local reefs and local fishery systems and how those could be used to understand diet, and move to the larger scale of ecosystems and food supply chains. And then on the other hand, we had Matti and then Kyle come in from a very global perspective and talk about how global learnings could be used to influence change at the national or even local level. So I think there was a very interesting transition between scales that I hope you'll be able to capture in this panel discussion as well. So James, I'm going to start with you and sort of, in terms of scaling up. So there is this interest, of course, a growing interest in blue foods, the recognition that marine sources can actually meet a lot of nutritional requirements, but there is also the understanding that these sources can be very vulnerable to a number of shocks. And interestingly, in your work, you've shown that actually coral reefs are quite resilient when it comes to dealing with heat events, for example, and still being able to meet nutritional needs. So I'm wondering if you could comment upon how our learnings from these coral reef systems and the work that you've done, how that can be extrapolated to the larger question of making blue foods a more resilient nutritional source.
Yeah, lots of great issues in there. I think first off, what comes to my mind is that we know that fisheries management works, whether that's temperate stock assessments in the States and Canada, whether that's indigenous management of coral reefs. They work, they protect fish stocks. We see benefits to the ecosystems relative to places that have no forms of management. So I think when we're trying to understand or predict resilience of seafood systems, what we want to be doing is enacting locally appropriate management and trying to ensure that we're catching the right species in the right amounts at the right times of year.
Great, thank you. And I guess we will move now to the special issue that you mentioned, Kyle. So as you mentioned, you and Matti were co-guest editors. So I have questions for both of you. And I did want to remind all of you that you are free to jump in, so it doesn't have to be one person answering a question. If you would like to add comments, you're more than welcome to at any point. And I also want to remind our audience that if they have questions, they can add them in the Q&A box, and we'll try and get to them in the panel discussion as well. So Matti, I was going to start with you first. And in your editorial for that special focus issue, you talked about the need to expand the definition of sustainability to move beyond just food supply chains. I was wondering if you could comment on that, specifically on what this expanded definition would look like and why this would be important for assessing the resilience of global food systems.
Yeah, thanks. Good question. I think Kyle already nicely summarized some of these kind of opportunities or measures or ways how we can make the food supply chain more resilient. And it clearly shows that we cannot just concentrate on the poor kind of the core of the food supply, for example, in the food production. We just cannot concentrate on the food production per se, but we really need to understand how the different kind of policies or subsidies, as was mentioned by Kyle, and how the farmers' livelihoods. There has been riots, for example, in various parts of the globe on this. But then that comes also the affordability of the food, like what we have been seeing now, the huge rise in the food prices due to kind of outside from the food supply chain, if you like. The COVID first totally disturbed the net trade connections, and then now the Russian invasion and Ukraine, two of the among the most important exporters of cereals, and these are just some examples how we really need to, when we are talking about food, it really crosses many of the disciplines. And if not earlier, I think this kind of epoch where we are living now, it really brings the food to the center of the geopolitics. And I think it in a way, it's how the Russian, for example, uses the food as a tool to kind of negotiate. I think this is, of course, not ethical, but I think it has awakened many of the countries globally that, okay, we cannot anymore rely on this, totally on these imports, but we really need to start understanding how we can kind of use these different mechanisms and tools to be more resilient in terms of food. And this brings the kind of access to food, affordability, the well-being of people, and many other things which are linked. Maybe Kyle can continue from there, but this was just some of the reflections from my side.
Yeah, thanks, Matti. I think probably the only thing I'll add is it's important to make the distinction between food supply chains and food systems, where food supply chains are kind of like the physical backbone of the food supply chain, but food systems involve social considerations, differences between gender, vendor characteristics, individual characteristics, how foods are combined to form diets, and then ultimately how those diets dictate nutritional health outcomes. All of those things I think are important to consider when you're trying to develop or provide solutions for a more sustainable food system.
Very good.
Thank you.
Kyle.
Sorry, Matti, did you want to add something?
Wanted to thank Kyle. Yeah, thanks.
I'm really glad you brought up that point about additional factors that we need to consider beyond just the food supply chain itself, particularly the production aspect that you focused on in your work, because I think we heard from our speakers in the morning as well that there are so many different nuances to considering resilience, and can't really separate inclusion and resilience as two different aspects of the same. They're actually part of the same discussion. So especially things related to food preparation, to gender, to socioeconomic influences. So I'm really glad you brought that up. I did want to ask you in particular, Kyle, where do you think are big gaps in some of those factors? Because in your work, you've presented this really broad understanding of specific aspects of crop production, for example. But in terms of these socioeconomic factors, obviously there's a lot to understand, but where do you think we should be starting, or where do you see the biggest gaps that we need to fill the fastest?
Yeah, I think in large part that gets at your comment about scale at the very beginning, where I think of like the global work that Matti and I do, or that we presented as being really nice like sandboxes for testing out opportunities and identifying where there are broad opportunities for particular solutions to potentially have a really big impact or benefit. But that's where those types of analyses end or are limited. And I think taking into account context-specific factors, policy landscapes, economic landscapes within specific countries or specific locations is essential for really identifying what's like the realistic solution space that you have to work with when you're trying to implement a solution in a particular place. So I think that's a really important direction that that kind of like actionable, sustainable, and resilient food system research can move, is to understand where are the particular levers that can be pulled, either economic tools or existing policies that can serve as kind of the conduit for implementing these solutions on the ground in different places and adapting them for local contexts and local preferences.
And hopefully we'll touch upon some of those aspects tomorrow when we're talking about governance and transformation. So James, a question for you, which is really that, in your work, you work with local communities that follow indigenous food practices and have local food traditions. And these communities are often the most vulnerable, but they also have a lot of lessons to offer us in terms of resilient food practices. So can you comment maybe on, how these communities can contribute to enhancing local resilience, and if there are lessons we can learn from them to implement at the global scale?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and I have mostly worked with coral reefs and how they're managed. And what I was saying previously about local indigenous forms of management, they work very well on coral reefs. And I think one lesson there is there's no one size fits all. A reef is going to behave differently to a climate stress, whether it's in Seychelles or it's in Australia or it's in Indonesia. So simply, I don't know, implementing a no-take zone doesn't necessarily benefit the ecosystem and then the food supply as well. I think that the idea of understanding how local communities make these systems resilient, is maybe the wrong way to think about it. And this comes back to what you've discussed about scale, is that ways of managing small-scale food systems have been disrupted and overwhelmed by that global food system. So, for example, in West Africa, that might be trade of fish that are very important as a local food, diverting those fish away for non-human uses. And so the ability of local communities to manage their resource has been compromised already in lots of places. And that is context specific again. So in West Africa, it might be one factor, in the Great Lakes another, and within each country, again, slightly different influences. So I guess when we're thinking about how communities make their systems resilient, we also have to take quite a deep look at how global systems are affecting their ability to do that. And that starts at home as well.
That's a great point. And Kyle and Matti, I wonder if both of you can comment on the inverse. where, instead of taking local food systems and then seeing how they integrate into the global picture, how do we take the kind of global data that you work with? You described it as a sandbox that can be used to play around in and model different systems. And I was wondering if you'd expand on that a little bit more about how we can transition from that global scale to more local solutions that are focused on resilience.
Yeah, I think in part, addressing that requires a comprehensive accounting of the different actors that are having influence at different scales. Because if I'm just thinking like of the example, if you wanted to tell consumers that they should purchase a more sustainable diet or a more resilient diet, there's only so much agency that an individual consumer can exercise within their food choices, and much of the food choices that are provided to an individual consumer are dictated by multinational, vertically integrated companies. So taking into account the different actors and the role that they play in limiting or enhancing the resilience of consumers or local communities, I think is a really important step in that direction. I'm not sure if Matti has something he wants to add.
Yeah, I've been thinking that a lot, and always sometimes also challenged, like what is the value of the global studies, for example, what I do. And yes, I do agree with many of the that the actions should be done often on the quite local or maybe national scale. The policies maybe national or maybe EU in my case, both. And then but then the kind of really the global studies, to my view, like how I see them, is more kind of showing, okay, the overall potential and putting also different places to context with each other, kind of what are the, like Kyle showed, these hotspots. Okay, these are really, without these global studies, we wouldn't be able to compare, for example, this mice sensitivity to climate in the how those compare, and also like where to put the efforts, maybe like in the geopolitics and so forth. So I think that's one angle how I see the value there. But for sure, I think that the local studies are really key in understanding, like also James pointed out, it really differs from place to place, country to country, what are the kind of the challenges and opportunities. So yeah, I think those are the kind of the best ways they work hand in hand.
Great. Thank you very much for that. And I think I'll move to a more general question for everybody, and then perhaps you can all start off with one and then chime in. And really, I think one of the things that has become clear from all of your talks today is the fact that any consideration of building a resilient food system has to take into account a number of factors beyond just the obvious question of where the food is coming from, how it's being produced, where it's being traded, how it's being consumed, the economics, the socio-political landscape, lots of different factors. So clearly, I think, it does make the point that we need probably an interdisciplinary approach, or at least, a variety of expertise from different points of view to really integrate all of that. So maybe to each of you, I would pose the question that, when it comes to understanding these multifactorial systems, which have lots of different moving parts, is there perhaps one action or one immediate attempt at a solution you could suggest that would help to address our gaps in understanding? So maybe, Matti, if we could start with you and then move to Kyle and James.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, not the easiest question. Maybe I just start like more from kind of my own work point of view. I think it was really good kind of what Kyle mentioned. Okay, what is the difference between food systems and food supply chains? And I think it's really the system understanding is the key here from our perspective. So So to really, and also what we argued in the commentary last year, which I wrote with Dieter Herten, published in One Earth, that there is really kind of a need for global system kind of understanding how the different parts of the food system interact with each other, and how kind of, if we do another one intervention somewhere, how it kind of how it impacts on other parts of it. And one example would be we are building not probably that comprehensive that would be needed, but in my group we are building the global food system model where we try to take into account all these interactions and from the planetary boundaries to the food production and to the consumption, and then also the social part. Of course, it's a huge undertaking that we are not even halfway through. But there, for example, one is that okay, there is a lot of these diet chains hype. Okay, if everyone would eat only plant-based food, we would be well off. But according to our model, actually, then it's if everyone would be vegan, it would be actually consume more resources compared to if we would produce a little bit of meat, because the livestock can, as I mentioned, they can consume these byproducts and other things that we are not able to consume. So actually, these kind of things that the kind of could and should be done with this food system understanding, and to really kind of expanding that to the many other levels. So this is one way of how I see it, that from my perspective, our work could help.
Yeah, I agree with what Matti said. Coming from a research perspective on resilience and sustainable food systems, I think what's really needed is defining sustainability and resilience based on stakeholder priorities, and that really depends on the scale that you're working at. And once you have a clear understanding of how exactly you're going to define sustainability and resilience, then determining ways to measure the different outcomes or the different dimensions of sustainability and resilience. And then finally, when you're able to measure and quantify that suite of outcomes that are important to the stakeholders from a variety of groups, then that enables solution testing and the examination of trade-offs, co-benefits, how different dimensions of sustainability and resilience can change with different types of interventions. So I think that's a really useful direction for the sustainable food systems field to kind of move in and think about. Yeah, and I think it's, again, really important for it's really important to interact with a diversity of groups and to think hard about who is getting to define sustainability and resilience and to what end.
Thanks. Well, I think Matti and Kyle, I think you covered quite a few things and emphasized that a lot is unknown. So I guess what I would say is that to get a better understanding of resilient diets, we still need to know today where our food system's flawed. Like, nutrient deficiencies are high in every country in the world, whether it's the UK, where I am, or sub-Saharan Africa. Different nutrients are lacking in diets, and we still don't have a great handle on why. So my research, it looks at seafood consumption, fisheries production, and tries to link that to diets. But then I'm missing the crops that Kyle's looking at. I'm missing the overall ecosystem perspective that Matti has. So I think in order to look forward and say, how do we build resilience into diets? We first need to say, why aren't diets healthy, and what are the factors causing that disconnection. And to do that, we need to link different food systems together and to obviously be very interdisciplinary about it.
Thank you. And I think through all of your points that you've made as part of this panel discussion, I know Matti alluded to it in his talk, where suddenly, resilience of food systems became an important conversation after the global pandemic and the Ukraine-Russia conflict, where we saw a massive increase in food prices, we saw sudden changes in availability, supply chain blocks, and what have you. And I think that certainly brought it to the forefront of the public conversation, but these were not things that we didn't already know. They were exposing weaknesses and frailties in the global food system that had been built in over time. And these events just, I think, exacerbated it and made it more obvious than uncovering something new that we didn't already know. And I think you've all made the point that we need to understand how different aspects of global food systems interact with each other in order to really understand how to build a resilient food system that can cope with these kinds of acute shocks like a pandemic or a war. And I was wondering if any of you, maybe Matti in particular, had any closing comments on what we can learn from these acute events that can translate into long-term outcomes.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think Kyle already mentioned that this was already known, like this vulnerability to this kind of shocks already. The researchers we were warning about it already for years, that it's already connected, the food systems, and when it works really well. Like when the system and this kind of trade network works, it works really well. If talking this part of your question, so it has ensured like a lot of diversity and in a way resilience to many countries, that the diversity in food supply and in diets. For example, in Finland, if we wouldn't have trade, I mean, we would be eating quite simple food over the winter, or very, very simple food. So I think the kind of now it has increased the resilience in a way of the citizens, but also the resilience to local shocks. But on the other hand, yes, when it's already connected, as we found in one of our studies, that there are less and less kind of nodes, that the important trade nodes that countries have. So they are very dependent on one or two countries. And what happened now, for example, with Ukraine and Russia, there are many countries, especially in Northern and Eastern Africa, that were almost totally reliable on these countries. And then when that node is knocked out, they are really kind of very vulnerable position. So what I'm trying to say that then I think it would be very important to start understanding, okay, it's the what is the resilience in this perspective. So we need to have the kind of backup plans to local shocks, but then we need to be resilient to the global shocks. So I think that each country, they need to kind of very carefully think what is our best strategy. Like now what Singapore, for example, is doing, they are by 2030, they are aiming to produce 30% of the food within this small plant, like a small city. So they are investing a lot on these new technologies, what I very briefly mentioned. There are some other examples as well, how countries are already kind of course, they're in a good position, they have a lot of money, but then if we take Somalia or some other country, they are very vulnerable position in this. So there are ways, but I think it's a good wake-up call for the global community and policymakers how to move forward.
Great, thank you. I think we're at time now. Did Kyle or James did you have anything to add, or I think Matti summarized those points quite well.
Yeah, I think I can just add briefly to what Matti said. I think really what these recent crises and shocks have shown is the level to which our food systems are are accepting of high levels of risk and large magnitude disruptions in the interest of improved high economic and productive efficiency. So I think there really need to be frank conversations along those lines about, are these levels of risk and exposure to these levels of disruptions going to continue to be acceptable in the interest of other benefits that some groups are reaping from a global food system?
That's a great point. Thank you. Okay, I guess we are at the end of this panel discussion. So thank you all very much, both for a series of excellent talks and for this really engaging panel discussion. We really appreciate your taking the time to be here. And I also wanted to thank our speakers from the previous session as well, again, for some great talks and a very fun discussion among them as well. So with that, we're at the end of our sessions for day one of this event. We've heard from a variety of speakers in the field talking about broad concepts of inclusion and resilience and how these would relate to sustainable diets. And we've also seen that these questions in some fundamental way are all interlinked to each other and can be thought of at a variety of scales, going from the local to the global, from individual behavior to the way governments and indeed world systems interact with each other. And in tomorrow's sessions, we will be hearing on themes related to governance and transformation. So for everything that we've discussed in terms of inclusion and resilience today, what kinds of behavioral and policy changes would you need to implement to actually make some of these visions a reality, if you will? So once again, thank you very much to all our speakers. Thank you to our audience for being here as well. We're at the end of this discussion and we hope to see all of you tomorrow. Thank you very much. Goodbye.